Jamal Carter stepped out of his office building into the cool night air, stretching his arms after another exhausting day in front of a computer screen. It was nearly 10 p.m., and the streets had mostly emptied out, leaving behind the occasional honk of a distant car and the hum of a street light buzzing overhead. He made his way toward the underground parking garage, pulling his jacket tighter against the crisp fall breeze. The garage was half empty, rows of parked cars casting long shadows under the flickering fluorescent lights. Something about the silence felt unnatural, but Jamal shook it off. He had been here hundreds of times before. As he walked toward his car, the sound of his own footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, blending with a faint dripping noise in the distance. Just as he reached into his pocket for his keys, a set of heavy boots thudded against the ground behind him. He froze. The weight of an unseen presence pressed against his senses. Slowly he turned his head. Three figures in dark uniforms stood at the entrance, their faces partially hidden by the dim light. A flashlight beam cut through the shadows, landing directly on his chest. "Hands where we can see them." Jamal Carter's breath hitched in his throat as the flashlight glare pinned him in place. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The three officers stepped forward, their heavy boots echoing in the vast emptiness of the parking garage. Their faces remained unreadable, but their body language was tense, too tense for what should have been a routine encounter. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," one of them commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. What the hell is going on? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had worked late, just like he always did, and was simply heading home. His fingers tightened around his car keys, the cold metal grounding him. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice even, though his pulse was hammering against his ribs. The officer in the lead, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, took another step closer. "We got a report of suspicious activity in the area," he said, but there was something off in his tone, like he wasn't telling the whole truth. Jamal's stomach twisted. He had heard stories like this before. A black man alone at night, minding his business, only to find himself face to face with officers looking for trouble. His fingers twitched, but he forced himself to stay still. "I just got off work," he said carefully. "I have my ID right here." He slowly reached into his pocket, but the moment he moved, the second officer, a younger guy with a buzz cut, reacted like he was pulling a weapon. "Hands up," he barked, stepping closer, hand hovering near his holster. Jamal's heart lurched. A cold, primal fear gripped him. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and this could turn deadly. He had seen it happen before. Names he knew, faces he'd mourned, turned into hashtags overnight. His hands shot up instinctively, palms open. "I'm not armed," he said quickly, his voice tight. "I'm just reaching for my wallet. That's it." Mustache hesitated, glancing at his partner before nodding. "Slowly." Jamal moved with exaggerated care, pulling his wallet out and flipping it open to reveal his ID and work badge. The officers barely looked at it before exchanging unreadable glances. "Step away from the car," Mustache repeated, this time more forceful. Jamal clenched his jaw. Something wasn't right. They weren't questioning him, weren't checking his ID properly. They had already decided he was guilty of something. His pulse pounded as the third officer, silent until now, reached for his radio. "Got him," the man muttered. "Got him? Got who?" Jamal's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a setup. Jamal's mind raced, his body frozen in place as the officer's words echoed through the garage. "Got him." The phrase settled in his gut like a heavy stone. They weren't here to investigate. They weren't here to ask questions. They had already made up their minds about who he was, what he was. His breath came shallow and fast, but he fought to keep his expression neutral. Panic would only make things worse. "I don't know what you think I did," he said, his voice measured despite the fear curling in his chest. "But I just finished work. I'm just trying to go home." The lead officer, Mustache, didn't even blink. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Jamal's fingers twitched. No, this isn't happening. He wasn't about to let himself be cuffed like some criminal when he hadn't done a damn thing wrong. His thoughts flickered to every story he had ever heard, Every name turned into a tragic headline. He knew how these encounters ended for people like him. "This is a mistake," he said, forcing himself to stay calm. "You haven't told me what I'm being detained for." Buzzcut sneered. "You're acting real guilty for someone with nothing to hide." Jamal swallowed hard. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, the air in the parking garage suddenly feeling too thin. "I know my rights," he said carefully, his hand still raised in surrender. "Unless I'm under arrest, I'm free to go." Silence. The officers exchanged looks. Jamal knew that silence. It was the kind that came right before things went bad. Then before he could react, Mustache grabbed his wrist in an iron grip and yanked him forward. "Hey!" Jamal jerked back on instinct, but it didn't matter. Buzzcut was already moving, shoving his shoulder hard enough to send him stumbling. A second later, a sharp pressure clamped onto his wrists. Handcuffs. The cold steel bit into his skin, and suddenly the fear he'd been trying to suppress surged up like wildfire. "This is wrong!" His voice came out harsher now, edged with disbelief. "You can't just—" A hand shoved his head down as they forced him toward their cruiser. His pulse roared in his ears. He twisted, trying to find someone, anyone, in the garage. But the place was empty, just rows of silent cars watching him get dragged away like he was nothing. The distant click of a radio crackled. "Suspect in custody," the third officer muttered, as if this had been inevitable. Jamal clenched his teeth, fighting back the sickening feeling in his gut. This isn't over. As the squad car door slammed shut behind him, he realized one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than him. Jamal sat stiffly in the back of the squad car, his hands still locked in the unforgiving grip of the handcuffs. His breathing was shallow, his mind scrambling for a way out of this nightmare. The low hum of the engine filled the silence, interrupted only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. Outside, the city lights blurred past the rain-speckled windows, a cruel contrast to the suffocating confinement inside. "This is a mistake," he muttered, more to himself than to the officers in the front. His voice was steady, but his heart was thrashing against his ribs. "You haven't even told me what I'm being charged with." Buzzcut glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his smirk faint but unmistakable. "Disturbing the peace," he said casually, like he was reading off a menu. Jamal felt a fresh wave of anger flood through him. Disturbing the peace? He had been minding his own business, trying to go home after a long day. How was he the disturbance? But he knew the truth. The disturbance wasn't his actions. It was his existence in a place they decided he didn't belong. He shifted against the cuffs, the metal digging into his wrists. His military training had taught him discipline, had drilled into him the importance of staying calm under pressure. But this wasn't a battlefield, at least not the kind he had prepared for. This was something worse. Because here, in this system, the enemy didn't wear a different uniform. They wore the same one he had sworn to respect. The squad car made a sharp turn, and Jamal finally recognized where they were headed. Not the nearest precinct, not even the downtown station. They were taking him somewhere else, somewhere off the usual path. His stomach tightened. "Where are you taking me?" His voice was firm now, demanding. No answer. Mustache kept his gaze locked on the road, jaw tight, hands gripping the wheel like he had something to prove. The third officer, the quiet one, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Jamal's pulse spiked. This wasn't right. If they were following protocol, he'd be in a holding cell by now, waiting for processing. But this silence, this detour, this was something else. "I have rights," he said, louder this time. "I want my lawyer." Buzzcut scoffed. "Yeah? Good luck with that." Something inside Jamal snapped. His whole life, he had played by the rules, served his country, worked hard, kept his head down when he needed to. But now, sitting in the back of this car, wrists bound, his future dangling on the whims of three men who saw him as nothing more than a threat, he realized something chilling. The rules had never been made to protect him. The car slowed to a stop, and Jamal braced himself for whatever came next. Jamal's breath was steady, but his mind raced as the squad car jerked to a stop. His body tensed. This wasn't the police station. The street was dimly lit, a stretch of cracked pavement lined with abandoned buildings. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, too far for anyone to see or hear what was about to happen. A cold realization settled over him. They didn't just want to arrest me, they wanted to make me disappear. Buzzcut turned in his seat, his smirk now a full-blown sneer. Time for a little talk. The door swung open, and before Jamal could react, Mustache yanked him out of the car, his grip bruising. He stumbled, but didn't fall, his instincts keeping him upright. The quiet officer lingered near the trunk, his eyes darting away like he wanted no part of this. Jamal straightened his shoulders, refusing to show fear. This isn't procedure, he said, his voice controlled but firm. You're way off course. Mustache shoved him against the car. Yeah? Who's gonna stop us? Jamal clenched his jaw. His military training had prepared him for a lot, but not this, not being on the receiving end of the very system he had sworn to protect. Buzzcut stepped closer, his voice low. See? Guys like you think you're untouchable, but out here? He gestured around. No cameras, no witnesses. Jamal's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. The quiet officer shifted uncomfortably. We should just take him in, he muttered, barely audible. Buzzcut shot him a glare. Shut up! Jamal seized on that hesitation. He's right, he said, locking eyes with the younger officer. You know this isn't right. For a moment, the officer hesitated. Then, sirens. Loud and approaching fast. Buzzcut's head snapped up, his sneer faltering. Damn it! Jamal exhaled slowly. Somebody called this in. A patrol car screeched to a halt nearby, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, hands hovering near their weapons. What's going on here? One demanded. Mustache released Jamal immediately, stepping back like nothing had happened. Suspect was resisting, he said smoothly. We were securing the situation. Jamal lifted his hands and still cuffed. I was never resisting. His voice was even, but his fury was barely contained. The newly arrived officers exchanged glances. One of them recognized Jamal. Wait, you're Sergeant Jamal Carter, National Guard. Buzzcut's expression shifted, realizing too late that their power was slipping. Jamal straightened, his voice calm but lethal. That's right, and you just made the biggest mistake of your careers. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jamal sat in the courtroom, his wrists finally free of the cuffs but still bearing the marks of the injustice he had endured. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, but he refused to bow under it. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had been silenced, pushed aside, and treated like they didn't belong. The prosecutor stood, his polished suit and rehearsed confidence, doing little to mask the weakness in his argument. Your Honor, the defendant was aggressive and non-compliant. The officers acted accordingly. Jamal let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. Lies. When the judge turned to him, he stood tall. His voice was steady but filled with conviction. I was not aggressive, I was targeted, and I will not let this slide. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his military ID, and held it up for everyone to see. I served this country, and yet I was treated like a criminal for simply existing. A heavy silence filled the room. The judge's gavel came down. All charges against Sergeant Carter are dismissed. Jamal exhaled, but he wasn't done. He turned to the officers who had wronged him. This isn't over. And he meant it. Jamal's story is more than just a personal battle. It's a reminder of the deep flaws in the system and the resilience needed to stand against them. His experience teaches us that injustice can happen anywhere, even to those who have dedicated their lives to service. But more importantly, it shows that silence is never the answer. One key lesson is the importance of knowing your rights. In moments of crisis, fear can take over, but staying informed and standing firm can make all the difference. Jamal refused to be intimidated, and that courage led to justice. Another takeaway is the power of accountability. Corruption thrives when people look the other way. If you witness injustice, speak up. Support those who are wrongfully targeted. Change only happens when people refuse to accept the status quo. Finally, resilience is key. The world isn't always fair, but giving up only lets those in power win. Jamal's fight didn't end in the courtroom. It became a movement. His story reminds us that justice isn't given, It's demanded. Stand up. Speak out. Never let fear silence the truth. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment number 1 to let us know that you have watched the whole video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.